The night of April 8th, 1989 looked completely ordinary from the outside. A residential street in Guadalajara, Mexico. Neat houses behind iron gates. A dog barking somewhere 2 blocks over. The kind of neighborhood where nothing happens, or where everything is designed to look that way. Inside one of those houses, a man was finishing dinner. He was 42 years old, medium height, with the careful posture of someone who had spent years making himself easy to underestimate. No gold chains, no bodyguards visible at the table. His suit was the kind a mid-level bank manager might wear to a client meeting. Dark, pressed, forgettable. The meal was simple. He ate slowly, the way people eat when they are not afraid of being interrupted. His name was Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, and at that moment he controlled every significant drug trafficking route in Mexico. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. Not some of the routes, not a piece of the operation, every route, every plaza, every bribed official from the Sonoran Desert to the Guatemala border. The cocaine coming up from Colombia, the marijuana and heroin moving north into the United States. All of it passed through a network that existed in its current form because this one man had designed it, negotiated it, and held it together through a combination of money, patience, and a telephone directory that contained numbers no drug lord should have ever possessed. The federal agents arrived at approximately 9 in the evening. There were dozens of them, from the newly formed Federal Judicial Police, and they came with the particular tension of men who had been told this was the most important arrest of their careers, and were not entirely sure they believed they would make it out. The street was blocked at both ends. The operation had been planned for weeks. Someone had given them the address, the schedule, the layout of the house. Someone always does. What happened next is what no one expected. He did not run. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not attempt to barter or threaten or disappear through a back door. He set down his fork, stood up from the table and picked up the telephone. One call, brief. He spoke for less than 2 minutes. Then he placed the receiver down, straightened his jacket and walked to the front door to meet the men coming through it. The agents found no weapons on his person, no cash on the table. Nothing in the house that looked like a command center for the largest drug trafficking organization in the Western Hemisphere. Just a dinner, half finished, going cold on the table. He was handcuffed and led to a waiting vehicle, and as the convoy pulled away from the house, the street returned to silence. The dog somewhere in the distance had stopped barking. The lights in the neighboring houses stayed off. Nobody came to their windows. In Mexico City, the Attorney General went on television that night to announce a historic achievement. The government had captured the most powerful drug trafficker in the country's history. The war on drugs had scored its greatest victory. The reporters wrote it down and broadcast it, and the next morning the front pages confirmed it. What the front pages did not report, what almost nobody understood yet, was what had happened in the 2 minutes of that phone call. Because within weeks of his arrest, something extraordinary began to occur. The organization he had built did not collapse. It did not fracture into confusion. It did not surrender. Instead, with a precision that suggested long preparation, it divided, cleanly, deliberately, like a cell splitting under a microscope, into separate independent organizations, each one inheriting a piece of his empire, each one planting itself into a different corner of Mexico and growing. The Tijuana Cartel, the Juarez Cartel, the Sonora Cartel, the organization that would eventually become the most powerful and most globally distributed drug trafficking network in history, the Sinaloa Cartel, led by a logistics coordinator from the mountains who had once carried boxes and run errands and absorbed everything he watched. His name was Joaquin Guzman Loera. The world would eventually know him as El Chapo. Every single one of these organizations that would go on to kill hundreds of thousands of people, flood entire countries with narcotics, corrupt governments on multiple continents, and outlast every law enforcement effort directed against them. Every single one of them was born in that moment, in that phone call, in those 2 minutes before a man in a pressed suit walked calmly to his own arrest. That is the detail that stops everything. Not that he was caught, that he arranged what came next before the handcuffs went on, which raises the question that this entire story exists to answer, the question that Mexican prosecutors, DEA analysts, journalists and historians have spent decades circling without ever fully resolving. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo did not come from a cartel family. He was not born into crime. He did not inherit a network or seize one by force. He built it from almost nothing in a country where the structures for what he was attempting had never existed. And he built it so well that his arrest did not end it. It multiplied it. So who was this man, really? Where did he come from? And how does someone go from a poor family in the mountains of Sinaloa to a dinner table in Guadalajara where a single phone call reshapes the criminal geography of an entire continent? The answer begins in a place where the mountains are so steep that in some villages the sun only reaches the valley floor for 4 hours a day, and where the soil, thin and dry and stubborn, had been growing one particular crop for generations before anyone thought to call it a problem. Sinaloa is not one place. It is several worlds stacked on top of each other. Along the coast, the Pacific sits flat and silver, and the port city of Mazatlan moves with commerce and noise and the particular confidence of a place that has always had access to the sea. Further inland, the land flattens into fertile valleys, where tomatoes and chickpeas grow in long organized rows, and where the agricultural wealth of northwestern Mexico concentrates itself into something almost prosperous. But push further east, into the Sierra Madre Occidental, the mountain range that runs like a broken spine down the western edge of Mexico, and the world changes completely. The roads up there in the 1940s were not really roads. They were decisions. Dry creek beds that became rivers in the rainy season, narrow ledges carved into cliff faces, paths that required knowing where you were going before you started because there were no signs and no one to ask. Villages up in those mountains had been functionally isolated from the Mexican state for generations, not because the state had abandoned them, but because the terrain made governance nearly theoretical. Tax collectors did not venture up there. Neither did most police. Neither did much of anything from the world below. What did grow up there, in the thin rocky soil at altitude, was the opium poppy. It had been cultivated in the Sinaloa mountains since at least the 19th century, brought originally by Chinese immigrant workers who came to build the railways and stayed to farm. By the time Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo was born in 1946, opium cultivation in the Sierra was simply part of the agricultural landscape, not celebrated, not hidden, just present, the way certain crops are present in certain places because the conditions happen to be right, and the alternative is going hungry. Culiacan, where the Felix Gallardo family lived, sits at the bottom of that world. The capital of Sinaloa, it is the point where the mountains meet the valley, where the isolation of the Sierra bleeds into the commerce of the coast. In 1946, it was a mid-sized city of unpaved side streets, open-air markets, and the kind of heat in August that makes the air above the pavement shimmer and distort. The family was not destitute. They were something more complicated than that. The specific Mexican working-class dignity of people who have enough to eat, but understand, without anyone saying it directly, that the distance between them and nothing is not very large. Miguel was the kind of child that teachers remember not because he caused problems, but because he didn't. Attentive, quiet in a way that suggested he was processing rather than absent. He read when other boys were outside. He watched adults in conversation with an attention that was slightly unusual for his age, studying not just what was being said, but how and to whom, and what shifted in the room when certain names were mentioned. He finished school. That alone separated him from many of his peers, and then, in his late teens, he got a job that would change everything, though it would not look like much at the time. Through a family connection, he was hired as a low-level assistant in the household of Leopoldo Sanchez Celis, the governor of Sinaloa. He ran errands. He carried messages. He stood near doors and waited to be useful. The job paid modestly. The education it provided was incalculable. For several years, the young man from Culiacan moved through the margins of real power, not exercising it, not close enough to touch it, but near enough to understand its texture. He watched how the governor moved through a room, and how the room rearranged itself around him. He saw which men waited to be acknowledged, and which men were greeted first. He learned that the most important conversations never happened in the office. They happened in the car, or at the dinner table, or in the 30 seconds before a formal meeting, when two men stepped aside and spoke quietly, and then returned to their seats and behaved as though nothing had been decided. He was absorbing a curriculum that no school offered. What he was learning specifically was the architecture of Mexican political power in the mid-20th century, and that architecture had a very particular feature. The ruling party, the PRI, had governed Mexico without interruption since 1929, and it maintained that governance not through ideology alone, but through a system of managed relationships between the state, business, and various interests that operated in legal grey areas. Loyalty moved upward, protection moved downward. Everyone understood their position in the chain, and the chain held as long as everyone received what they had been promised. This was not corruption in the chaotic sense. It was corruption as infrastructure. The young Felix Gallardo filed this away. He did not yet know exactly what he would do with it, but he understood, at a level that would prove crucial, that protection from above was worth more than any weapon, and that the key to protection was making yourself valuable to someone who had more to lose than you did. By his mid-20s, he had also joined the Federal Judicial Police, the same federal law enforcement body that would, decades later, arrest him. He served briefly as an officer. He learned how investigations worked, how evidence was gathered, which procedures could be exploited and which could not. He saw from the inside how the state monitored the things it wanted to monitor and ignored the things it had been paid to ignore. Then he left the police. He had a clearer picture now of the entire playing field, the political world, the law enforcement world, the world of managed relationships and deniable arrangements. He was in his late 20s. He had no money and no criminal organisation, and the specific combination of knowledge in his head had no obvious legitimate application. But in the mountains above Culiacan, the poppies were flowering, and in the valleys below, a man named Pedro Aviles Perez had just begun to understand that what grew up there could be turned into something that moved north across a border and came back as American dollars. Felix Gallardo knew Aviles by reputation before he knew him personally. Everyone in Sinaloa did. Aviles was not yet what journalists would later call the grandfather of Mexican drug trafficking. He was still building that title, but the operation he was assembling had a quality that the young former police officer recognized immediately. It was structured like a government, and the one thing Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo understood better than almost anyone around him was how governments actually worked. What happened when those two things, his understanding and Aviles' operation, came into contact with each other is where the story truly begins. But before it does, one fact needs to be established, because without it, nothing that follows makes sense. Felix Gallardo did not enter the drug trade because he had no options. He entered it because he had studied every option available to a man of his background and his intelligence in Mexico in the early 1970s, and he had made a calculation. What that calculation was, and where it led him within the first 3 years, is something that would have been almost impossible to predict. Pedro Aviles Perez ran his operation out of Culiacan with the low profile of a man who understood that visibility was the enemy of longevity. He was not flashy. He drove ordinary vehicles, lived in an ordinary house, and conducted his business through layers of intermediaries who insulated him from direct contact with product. What he had built by the early 1970s was the first genuinely organized drug trafficking network in Sinaloa. Not a gang, not a loose collection of farmers selling to middlemen, but something with structure, with roots, with relationships on both sides of the border. He moved marijuana and heroin north into the United States through a series of established crossings, using a network of drivers, lookouts, and corrupted officials that he'd assembled over years of careful, patient work. He was also, by any measure, the ceiling of what Mexican drug trafficking had so far managed to become. Felix Gallardo came into his orbit sometime around 1972. The exact circumstances are not documented. This was not the kind of relationship that generated paperwork. What is known is that he began working with Aviles as a trusted operator, not a foot soldier. His background made him immediately useful in ways that most recruits were not. He understood how federal investigations were structured. He knew which officials responded to money and which ones needed something more subtle, a favor, a connection, a problem made to disappear. He spoke to people in authority without the deference or the edge that marked most men from the drug trade, because he had spent years in rooms with powerful people and learned to match their register. Avile noticed. He kept the young man close. For several years, Felix Gallardo watched and learned a second curriculum, this one about the mechanics of moving product across a border. He saw how loads were broken up and reassembled, how vehicles were modified, how money was counted and moved and cleaned. He met the men on the American side who received the shipments and turned them into cash. He travelled. He built his own relationships quietly, in parallel with the ones he was building for Aviles. Then, in September 1978, a Mexican federal police helicopter spotted Pedro Aviles Perez driving on a road outside Culiacan. They opened fire. Aviles died at the scene. The network he'd spent a decade constructing had no succession plan. The regional bosses began maneuvering. The American contacts went quiet, waiting to see who would emerge. The roots sat idle, losing money every day. Several men who had been with Aviles for years made plays for control, and found themselves unable to hold the pieces together, because the pieces were not designed to be held together by anyone except the man who had originally assembled them. Felix Gallardo did not make a play, not visibly, not yet. He spent several months doing something that looked, from the outside, like grief or paralysis, but was neither. He was consolidating quietly, reaching out to the American contacts personally, reassuring the corrupted officials that their arrangements would be honoured, mapping which parts of the network were intact and which had already dissolved. He was 32 years old, and he was conducting an audit of a collapsed criminal empire with the methodical patience of a man who already knew what he was going to build from the wreckage. By 1979, he had enough of the old network skeleton to begin building something new on top of it. But here is where the story shifts in a direction that nobody in Culiacan saw coming. While the remnants of Aviles' operation were still being sorted, something was happening 3,000 kilometers to the south that would transform the entire logic of drug trafficking in the Western Hemisphere. In Colombia, a young man from Medellin named Pablo Escobar had recognized something that most of his contemporaries had missed, that the demand for cocaine in the United States was not a small market waiting to be served, but a vast, largely untapped appetite that was about to explode, and that whoever controlled the supply chain to feed it would accumulate wealth on a scale that made the marijuana and heroin trade look like a corner store operation. Escobar and the organization that became the Medellin Cartel had the product. They had the refineries, the chemists, the coca fields in Peru and Bolivia, feeding a processing infrastructure in the Colombian jungle. What they did not have by the late 1970s was a reliable route into the United States. For years, the primary method had been through the Caribbean. Small planes landing in Florida, boats off the coast of Miami, the Bahamas used as a staging point. The DEA and the US Coast Guard had been hammering that route since the mid-1970s. Interdiction rates were climbing. Loads were being seized. The Caribbean corridor was becoming expensive and unreliable. Someone pointed south, then west, then north. Mexico shared a 2,000-mile land border with the United States. It had hundreds of official crossing points, thousands of miles of desert and mountain terrain that no border patrol could meaningfully monitor, and an existing infrastructure of corrupted officials and established smuggling networks that had been moving marijuana and heroin north for decades. The Colombians needed a partner. The first contact between the Medellin organization and the emerging Mexican trafficking networks happened through intermediaries in the early 1980s, carefully, incrementally, each side testing the other's reliability before committing to anything significant. Felix Gallardo was not the only Mexican trafficker approached, but he was the one who understood most clearly what was being offered and what it would require to accept it properly. The arrangement being proposed was straightforward in structure and staggering in implication. The Colombians would deliver cocaine to Mexico, by air, by sea, in whatever quantities could be moved. The Mexican organization would transport it across the border into the United States and deliver it to the Colombian distribution networks waiting on the other side. In exchange, the Mexicans would receive a transportation fee. Felix Gallardo listened to this and suggested a modification. Instead of a cash fee, he wanted payment in product. 50% of every shipment that crossed would belong to the Mexican organization outright, to distribute and sell independently through its own American contacts. The Colombians agreed. They needed the route badly enough to accept terms that, in retrospect, they would have reasons to regret. That single negotiation changed everything, not gradually, immediately. Before the cocaine deal, Mexican trafficking organizations were service providers in the American drug market, suppliers of marijuana and heroin to a customer base that operated primarily through American distribution networks. After the cocaine deal, they became independent operators with their own product and their own American market share, accumulating profits on a scale that the marijuana trade had never approached. To understand what 50% of the Colombian cocaine supply meant in practical terms, in the early 1980s, cocaine was selling in American cities for prices that now seem almost fictional. A kilogram that cost perhaps $2,000 to produce in Colombia was worth $50,000 on the streets of Los Angeles or Chicago. The volumes being moved were not dozens of kilograms, they were tons. Felix Gallardo ran the numbers. He understood what he now had in his hands, but he also understood something that most people around him did not, that the money was only useful if the structure protecting it was strong enough to hold, and the structure he currently had was a regional network in Sinaloa, functional but limited, designed for a trade that was about to become 10 times larger than anything it had been built to handle. He needed allies, he needed geography, he needed men he could trust to run pieces of an operation that was about to span the entire country. He already had 2 of them in mind, and the 3 of them together would build something that Mexico had never seen. Something so large, so carefully constructed, and so deeply embedded in the political fabric of the country that for almost a decade it would operate almost in the open. What that organization looked like from the inside, its logic, its hierarchy, its rules, its violence, is something that takes time to understand. Because from the outside, it looked almost impossible. From the inside, it made complete sense. The Guadalajara cartel was never supposed to be called a cartel. That word, with its implications of monopoly, structure, and boardroom-style coordination, was applied later by journalists and prosecutors trying to describe something that had no existing template. From the inside, it was simply the organization, or sometimes just the plaza, a term that pointed to the foundational concept holding everything together. Understanding the plaza system is the only way to understand how this organization existed at all, because without it, the scale of what was built seems impossible. A plaza, in this context, was a territory, a city, a border crossing, a region, a defined geographic space through which drugs could move north and money could move south. Each plaza had a price. Not a one-time payment, but a recurring fee paid upward through the political and law enforcement hierarchy in exchange for non-interference. Local police, state police, federal police, military commanders, customs officials at the border crossings. Each layer received its designated amount on a designated schedule, and in exchange shipments passed without incident. Investigations were redirected, and arrested members of the organization were quietly released or transferred to friendly facilities. This was not bribery in the improvised sense, a panicked payment to a specific officer at a specific moment. It was a budget line. It was infrastructure. Felix Gallardo did not invent this system. What he did was scale it, systematize it, and extend it further up the political chain than anyone before him had managed or attempted. He understood from his years near the governor's office that protection became truly reliable only when the people providing it had more to lose from its removal than from its continuation. The payments he arranged were large enough to matter to their recipients, large enough that cooperation was the rational choice every time. By the early 1980s, the organization had 3 men at its center. Felix Gallardo himself was the architect and the diplomat. He handled the Colombian relationship, the political connections, the overall strategic direction. He lived in Guadalajara in a house with a swimming pool and sent his children to private school. He attended mass. He was known in the city as a businessman. What kind of business was never specified, and in the social circles he moved through, the question was not asked. His phone rang constantly, and the calls were brief and oblique, full of the kind of coded language that, if overheard, sounded like nothing in particular. Rafael Caro Quintero was something else entirely. He was from the same mountains as Felix Gallardo, but carried those mountains differently, loudly, physically, with a temperament that swung between generosity and sudden brutality without visible transition. He was younger, rawer, and absolutely fearless in a way that made him both invaluable and dangerous. Where Felix Gallardo thought in systems, Caro Quintero thought in immediate results. He was the one who had seen, with the clarity of someone unbothered by complexity, that marijuana could be grown not just in small mountain plots, but on an industrial scale. He had the energy and the ruthlessness to make that vision real, and his operations in the Chihuahua desert would eventually produce the largest marijuana plantation ever discovered in the Western Hemisphere. The third man was Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known universally as Don Neto. Older than both, with the sun-creased face of someone who had spent decades outdoors in Sinaloa, he carried a different kind of authority, the authority of accumulated experience and relationships that predated the organization itself. He had connections to the old networks, to the generation of traffickers who had worked in the 1960s and 1970s, and his presence gave the new organization a legitimacy and continuity that pure money could not buy. Men who might have been reluctant to align with too ambitious younger operators were willing to work under a structure that included Don Neto. The three of them did not operate as equals exactly. It was more like three instruments playing in the same key, and beneath them, moving product and managing logistics across the country's geography, was a generation of younger operators who would eventually become the story's next chapter. Among them, running transportation routes in Sinaloa with a precision that impressed everyone who worked with him, was a compact, quiet man with a thick moustache who had grown up in the mountain village of La Tuna in the Badiraguato municipality, so remote that the road connecting it to Culiacan was not paved until years after he had already left. He learned the trade the way most people in the organization learned it, from the bottom, carrying out instructions with efficiency and minimal drama, accumulating trust by never failing a task he was given. His name at this point mattered to almost no one outside the organization. Now consider what was happening simultaneously in a different building in a different city with a completely different view of all of this. The DEA office in Guadalajara in the early 1980s occupied a floor of the US consulate building, understaffed and operating on a budget that reflected how seriously Washington took the Mexico problem at that particular moment, which was not very seriously at all. The cocaine crisis in American cities was understood as a Colombian issue. Mexico was considered a transit country, a secondary concern, a place where the real story passed through on its way to somewhere more important. One agent disagreed with this assessment more vocally and more persistently than his superiors appreciated. Enrique Camarena Salazar had grown up in Mexicali, the son of a Mexican father and an American mother, raised on both sides of the border in the particular bilingual, bicultural existence that the borderlands produce. He had worked as a police officer in California before joining the DEA, and he brought to his work a driven quality that his colleagues attributed variously to idealism, competitiveness, and a personal fury at what drugs had done to communities he recognized. He was 31 years old when he arrived in Guadalajara in 1980, with a wife named Mika and 3 young sons, and he began almost immediately to do the thing that made him both effective and eventually a target. He talked to people, not informants in the formal sense, though he developed those too. He talked to farmers, to truck drivers, to low-level workers in the agricultural operations spreading across the Chihuahua Desert. He pieced together, from dozens of fragments gathered over months, a picture of an organization whose scale was unlike anything the DEA had previously documented in Mexico. He reported what he was finding back to Guadalajara and then back to Washington. The reports generated attention, and then concern, and then a specific operation targeting the agricultural infrastructure that Caro Quintero had built in the desert. In the Guadalajara cartel's offices, such as they were, since there were no offices, nobody knew Camarena's name yet. Nobody was watching the DEA with the attention it deserved. That was the first mistake, and in an organization that prided itself on seeing threats before they materialized, it was an extraordinary one. The Rancho Bufalo, when federal authorities finally flew over it in helicopters with DEA intelligence in hand, stretched across the Chihuahua Desert for approximately 2,500 acres. Workers, some of them brought in under conditions that investigators would later describe as forced labor, tended rows of marijuana plants under shade nets designed to hide the crop from aerial surveillance. The infrastructure on the property included irrigation systems, processing facilities, housing for the workers, and a security perimeter manned by armed guards. The estimated yield at full harvest represented a significant fraction of all the marijuana consumed in the United States that year. It was not hidden. Not really. It was simply so large that the mind resisted accepting it as real. Camarena had found it. He had documented it. He had delivered the intelligence that would bring it down. and somewhere in the chain of information flowing from his reports to the Mexican federal authorities who eventually acted on them, the Guadalajara cartel had a source. Someone told them the raid was coming. The organization knew in advance. They could not stop it. The political pressure from Washington was by then too direct, too public, too impossible for even their deepest connections to deflect. But they knew, and they knew specifically where the intelligence had come from. The name Enrique Camarena moved through the organization in the days after the November 1984 raid like a temperature change. Something felt before it was understood. Caro Quintero had lost $8 billion worth of product in a single morning. He had watched the helicopters on the news, the politicians congratulating each other, the American DEA representatives standing in front of the cameras in the Chihuahua desert looking satisfied. He was not a man who absorbed that kind of loss quietly. Felix Gallardo understood the danger in Caro Quintero's fury before anyone articulated it. He understood that what was about to happen next, if not managed carefully, would bring down consequences that no amount of money and no depth of political connection could contain. Whether he tried to stop it, and how hard, is a question that courts and investigators would wrestle with for decades. What happened on the morning of February 7th, 1985 happened regardless. At 10:15 in the morning on February 7th, 1985, Enrique Camarena left the US consulate in Guadalajara to meet his wife for lunch. He never arrived. Within the block surrounding the consulate, a group of men in plain clothes were waiting with the specific patience of people who had rehearsed this moment. They knew his face, his schedule, the route he walked. They knew which direction he turned when he exited the building. A car pulled alongside him. He was pushed inside. The street returned to its ordinary noise within seconds. Vendors, traffic, the particular indifference of a busy city that has learned not to see certain things. Mica Camarena waited at the restaurant. An hour passed, then 2. She knew before anyone told her. The DEA office in Guadalajara went into a controlled panic that within hours became an uncontrolled one. Agents began working their contacts, pulling on every thread they had, demanding answers from Mexican authorities who responded with the practiced helplessness of institutions that already knew exactly where Enrique Camarena was and had decided at some level above the people in the room not to share that information. In Washington, the State Department received the first briefings and understood immediately that this was not a situation with a clean resolution. An American federal agent, kidnapped in broad daylight outside a US diplomatic facility, in a city where his organization had been operating with the full knowledge and nominal cooperation of the Mexican government. The implications ran in several directions at once, and none of them were comfortable. The Mexican government launched a search. Roadblocks, public statements, the choreography of official concern. American agents on the ground watched it and noted, privately and then in their reports, that the roadblocks were placed in locations that would not have inconvenienced anyone moving a prisoner through the city. Camarena was alive. For 30 hours, he was kept alive. A doctor was present throughout, not to treat injuries, but to monitor vital signs, to calculate how much more the body could absorb before it stopped responding. The questions asked during those 30 hours covered everything Camarena knew: informants, operations, intelligence methods, how much the DEA had documented, what was in the reports he had sent to Washington, who his sources were inside the organization. Someone needed that information badly enough to keep him conscious for more than a day. This detail, the doctor, the deliberate extension of the interrogation beyond what simple revenge would have required, is the detail that investigators kept returning to in the years that followed. Rafael Caro Quintero's rage was real and documented. But rage does not requisition a physician. Rage does not conduct a structured intelligence debriefing. Something else was operating alongside the rage, something more clinical, and the question of who ordered that clinical component and why would become one of the most contested and consequential questions in the entire history of US-Mexico relations. His body was found on March 5, 1985, on a ranch outside the town of La Angostura in Michoacán, wrapped in plastic. A pilot who had worked for the DEA as an informant, Alfredo Zavala Avila, was found nearby. Both had been dead for approximately a month. The forensic examination confirmed what the 30 hours implied. The effect in Washington was immediate and volcanic. The DEA administrator at the time, Francis Mullen, told anyone who would listen that the Mexican government had been complicit, not through negligence, but through active involvement. American pressure on Mexico became total, suffocating, the kind of diplomatic assault that small economies cannot absorb for long. The border was subjected to what agents called Operation Intercept, a meticulous, deliberately slow inspection of every vehicle crossing from Mexico that created traffic backup stretching miles into Mexican territory and cost the border economy millions of dollars per day. Mexico felt it within a week. Rafael Caro Quintero had fled Guadalajara shortly after the kidnapping, first to Puerto Vallarta, then out of the country entirely. He landed in Costa Rica, which turned out to be a poor choice of refuge. Costa Rican authorities, operating with DEA intelligence and a level of American diplomatic pressure that left little room for the kind of delay that had characterized the Mexican response, arrested him in April 1985. He was extradited to Mexico and charged. Don Neto was picked up in Guadalajara the same month, taken by Mexican federal agents in an operation that his lawyer later argued was coordinated more by American DEA agents than Mexican authorities, a jurisdictional complaint that went nowhere given the circumstances. 2 of the 3 men at the center of the Guadalajara cartel were now in custody, and Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was not. He remained in Guadalajara, largely in the open, moving through the city with a reduced but still functional security arrangement. He attended his daughter's quinceañera that year, a celebration with hundreds of guests including, according to multiple accounts, senior Mexican law enforcement officials in attendance. He made phone calls, he met with people, he conducted business. The DEA knew where he was, Mexican authorities knew where he was, he knew that both institutions knew. And yet the arrest did not come, not that month, not that year, not for 4 more years after the murder of a federal agent that had convulsed 2 governments. The protection insulating him was not eroding, it was holding. This is the moment that reveals something about the architecture of what Félix Gallardo had built, something that becomes visible only now, under the pressure of a crisis that should have destroyed him. The political relationships he had spent 15 years cultivating were not decorative, they were load-bearing. When the weight came down, they held, even with the Americans screaming, even with 2 partners in prison, even with a dead DEA agent whose autopsy report was sitting on desks in Washington and being read by people with the authority to make life very difficult for the Mexican state. He was still standing, untouched, eating dinner in Guadalajara. But something had changed that was not visible from the outside. The Camarena murder had drawn a line that previously had not existed, a line that separated what the political system could protect from what it could not be seen protecting without destroying itself. Félix Gallardo understood this with the same analytical clarity he applied to everything else. The protection was real, but it had a ceiling, and the ceiling had just been lowered. He had 4 years to work with. He began using them. The reorganization he undertook between 1985 and 1989 was the work that nobody wrote about while it was happening, the internal restructuring of an empire in quiet anticipation of the moment its architect would no longer be free to manage it directly. New routes were established, new operators were elevated. the geography of the organization was quietly redrawn around the people who would inherit it. Meanwhile, in Washington, Operation Leyenda, the DEA's dedicated task force for the Camarena investigation, was doing something that law enforcement operations rarely do effectively. It was being patient. It was building a case not just against the men who had pulled Camarena from the street, but against every layer of the organization above them. It was following the money and the political connections and the communication trails with a focus that went beyond prosecution. It was trying to understand the full architecture of what the Guadalajara cartel actually was, who it paid, who protected it, and how high that chain of complicity reached. What the investigators were finding layer by layer was making some of them question whether a simple drug trafficking prosecution could contain what they were uncovering. Because some of the connections did not lead to criminal figures. They led somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that, in the mid-1980s, was occupied by people with very different concerns than drug trafficking. People who were focused on Central America, on Soviet influence, on a covert war being fought with money and weapons that could not officially exist. And those people, it turned out, had needed someone to move things across the Mexican border that were not cocaine. The years between 1985 and 1989 were the most productive of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo's entire career. That fact alone requires a moment to absorb. His two closest partners were in prison. An American agent was dead because of decisions made inside his organization. The DEA had dedicated an entire task force to dismantling everything he had built. The Mexican government was under sustained diplomatic pressure from Washington that showed no sign of releasing. By any conventional measure, these were the conditions for an organization's collapse. Instead, the Guadalajara cartel expanded. With Caro Quintero and Don Neto removed from the operational picture, there was no longer a triumvirate to consult, no internal friction to navigate, no competing temperaments pulling the organization in different directions. There was one decision-maker, and that decision-maker, freed from the management of his partner's egos and impulses, moved with a speed and clarity that the previous structure had never quite allowed. The first expansion was geographic. Felix Gallardo had spent years understanding that the organization's vulnerability lay in its concentration. Too much product moving through too few routes, too much dependency on specific border crossings that could be shut down by a single interdiction operation. He began distributing the load across the entire northern border of Mexico, assigning specific corridors to specific operators and backing those assignments with the same political infrastructure that had protected the original Sinaloa operation. Tijuana, in the far northwest corner of Mexico, became a priority corridor. The city sat directly across from San Diego, one of the busiest border crossings in the world. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles per month, a volume that made meaningful inspection statistically impossible and practically absurd. Felix Gallardo placed the Tijuana operations under the supervision of a family he trusted. The 7 Arellano Felix brothers, sons of a woman who was related to him by marriage, young men of varying temperaments who shared a collective ferocity that made them effective enforcers and dangerous subordinates simultaneously. Ciudad Juarez, directly across from El Paso, Texas, was assigned to a man named Pablo Acosta Villarreal. And when Acosta was killed by Mexican federal police in 1987, control of the Juarez corridor passed to an operator who'd been quietly building his infrastructure there for years, a man named Amado Carrillo Fuentes, nephew of Don Neto, who had learned the trade from his uncle and had the additional quality of being almost entirely without visible ego, which in this business was either a sign of exceptional discipline or a warning sign that was easy to misread as contentment. The Pacific coast routes through Sonora were assigned to a separate faction. The Sinaloa operations, the heartland, the original territory, remained under direct oversight, managed through a layer of trusted coordinators that included the compact, efficient logistics operator from La Tuna, who continued to distinguish himself by the simple and apparently rare quality of doing exactly what he was told, delivering exactly what he promised, and asking for nothing beyond his designated share. The organization was no longer a cartel in the singular sense. It was a federation, a collection of regional operations united by shared political protection, shared Colombian supply, and the authority of one man whose phone calls connected every piece to every other. Felix Gallardo moved his base of operations to Culiacan during this period, then back to Guadalajara, then briefly to Mexico City, never staying long enough in any single location to establish the kind of routine that made surveillance straightforward. His security arrangements were lighter than most people in his position would have considered prudent. He operated on the theory that a man surrounded by visible armed guards announced his own importance, while a man who looked like a businessman generated no operational interest from anyone watching the street. He was right about this, until he wasn't. The Colombian relationship was simultaneously deepening and shifting in ways that would have long-term consequences. Pablo Escobar's war against the Colombian state was escalating through the late 1980s into something that was destabilizing the entire Colombian political system. Bombings, assassinations, the murder of judges and politicians and presidential candidates on a scale that was making the Medellin cartel an international liability rather than simply a criminal organization. The Cali cartel, Medellin's more disciplined rival, was watching Escobar's chaos and drawing conclusions about the value of a lower profile. Both Colombian organizations needed the Mexican roots more than ever, which meant Felix Gallardo's negotiating position was stronger in 1988 than it had been in 1982. He used that leverage carefully. The 50% payment in product arrangement was refined and formalized. The volumes increased. In certain months, the loads crossing through Mexican corridors into the United States were measured not in hundreds of kilograms, but in multi-ton shipments, quantities so large that they required coordination between multiple border crossings, multiple transportation networks, and multiple distribution contacts on the American side, all moving in parallel, all generating the kind of money that was beginning to pose its own logistical problems. Laundering that money required infrastructure almost as complex as moving the product. Real estate in Mexico City, businesses in Guadalajara, investments routed through shell companies in Panama, in the Cayman Islands, through financial institutions whose compliance departments asked questions in inverse proportion to the size of the deposits they were receiving. Felix Gallardo employed people specifically to manage this flow. Accountants and lawyers who understood that their professional licenses were, in this context, operational assets. His personal wealth during this period was never precisely calculated. Estimates ranged from hundreds of millions to several $billion, depending on which assets investigators could trace and how many they suspected existed beyond their visibility. He did not display it. The house was comfortable, but not extraordinary. His children did not attend schools that drew attention. He drove vehicles that did not invite a second look. Now watch what was happening in the same years inside the DEA, because the two storylines were converging in ways that neither side fully understood yet. Operation Leyenda had evolved from a murder investigation into something closer to an archaeological excavation, digging through layers of the Guadalajara cartel's political connections and finding repeatedly artifacts that did not belong to a simple drug trafficking story. DFS credentials, official badges from Mexico's Dirección Federal de Seguridad, the country's internal intelligence service, had been found in the possession of men connected to the Camarena kidnapping. Not fake badges, real ones. The DFS was not a minor institution. It was Mexico's version of a secret police, responsible for internal security, political surveillance, and the management of threats to the Mexican state. The idea that its officers had participated in the kidnapping and murder of an American DEA agent was not a fringe allegation. It was documented, evidenced, and deeply alarming to everyone who understood what it implied. It implied that the relationship between the Guadalajara cartel and the Mexican state went further than purchased indifference. Some investigators began using a different framework, not corruption, but collaboration. Not a criminal organization that had bought protection from a government, but a criminal organization that had been, at certain levels and for certain purposes, integrated into the government's operational activities. In Washington, this framework created a problem that no one wanted to discuss out loud. Because if the DFS had been involved in protecting the Guadalajara cartel, and the DFS had, during the 1980s, maintained a working relationship with the CIA as part of Cold War intelligence sharing in Central America, then the question of what the CIA had known about the cartel, and when, and whether that knowledge had ever influenced the pace or direction of American drug enforcement efforts in Mexico, was a question that led to very uncomfortable addresses. Congressional investigators would later document that aircraft connected to the Contra supply network, the covert American operation providing weapons and support to Nicaraguan rebels fighting the Sandinista government, had used Mexican airstrips, that some of those flights carried weapons south and returned north with cargo that was not declared to customs, that certain individuals connected to both the Contra operation and the Guadalajara cartel had moved between both worlds with a fluency that suggested the worlds were not entirely separate. Felix Gallardo, in later interviews conducted from prison, acknowledged the Colombian relationship, the political payments, the scale of the operation he had run. On the question of any deeper institutional connections, any arrangement that went beyond the standard architecture of bribery, he was precise in a different way. He said what he said. He did not say what he did not say. And the gap between the two was wide enough to contain a great deal. The DEA agents on the ground in Mexico had a simpler view. They had watched a man operate openly in Guadalajara for 4 years after the murder of their colleague. They had filed reports, built cases, made requests through official channels, and for 4 years the official channels had produced nothing. By 1988, the pressure from Washington had become impossible for the Mexican government to continue absorbing. The political calculation was shifting. Protecting Felix Gallardo was becoming more expensive than sacrificing him, not in money, but in the currency that the PRI actually ran on, which was the appearance of legitimacy and the maintenance of a functional relationship with its largest trading partner and neighbour, someone at some level of the Mexican government that has never been precisely identified, made a decision. And Felix Gallardo, who had been reading the political weather of Mexico for his entire adult life, felt the temperature change before the storm arrived. What he did next, in the weeks and months before April 8, 1989, was not the behaviour of a man preparing to fight. It was the behaviour of a man preparing to hand something over. And what he handed over, and to whom, would determine the shape of organised crime in Mexico for the next 3 decades. But before the handover, one more thing needs to be understood about what he had actually built, because the full picture of its reach, its depth, and its political entanglement only became clear through a series of revelations that reframed everything that had come before. What investigators found when they finally got access to the records and the witnesses and the documents that 4 years of obstruction had kept just out of reach was not what they had been expecting to find. What investigators expected to find when the documents finally began moving was a drug trafficking organization with political protection. What they found was something that required a different vocabulary entirely. The Dirección Federal de Seguridad, the DFS, had been Mexico's primary domestic intelligence apparatus since 1947. It reported directly to the Interior Ministry, operated with minimal judicial oversight, and during the Cold War maintained a close working relationship with the CIA that was considered mutually beneficial by both institutions. The CIA valued the DFS for its penetration of leftist political movements in Mexico and Central America. The DFS valued the CIA relationship for the resources, the training, and the institutional legitimacy it provided in a region where American approval mattered enormously to the ruling party's sense of its own security. DFS credentials were not easy to obtain. They were issued through a controlled process, tracked, accounted for. When agents investigating the Camarena murder found those credentials on individuals connected to the kidnapping, the initial interpretation was corruption. Someone inside the DFS had sold badges to cartel operatives wanting the ability to move through police checkpoints without being stopped. It was the simplest explanation, and in Mexico in the 1980s, simple corruption explanations were almost always available, and almost always partially true. But the deeper investigation produced a more complicated picture. Some of the individuals carrying DFS credentials were not civilians who had purchased protection. They were actual DFS operatives, people who'd been formally employed by Mexican intelligence, who appeared in the agency's personnel records, who had supervisors and case files and institutional histories. And their connection to the Guadalajara cartel was not incidental, it was operational. They had not wandered into the cartel's orbit through corruption. They had been placed there, or had developed there, in ways that suggested the boundary between the intelligence apparatus and the trafficking organization was, in certain specific areas, not a boundary at all. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo had not simply purchased protection from the Mexican state. He had, in some functional sense, become part of it. This reframes everything told so far. The man who had spent his early career studying how power worked from the inside of a governor's household, who had served briefly in federal law enforcement, who had built an organization structured explicitly around the logic of Mexican political relationships, that man had not been bribing his way around the state. He had been weaving himself into it. The payments were not transactional. They were relational. They were the maintenance cost of a genuine institutional integration that operated in both directions. The DFS, for its part, had interests in the Guadalajara cartel that went beyond the money it received. The cartel's logistics infrastructure, its aircraft, its border-crossing arrangements, its network of safe houses and corrupted officials across the country, was useful for purposes that had nothing to do with cocaine. Moving people and materials across borders without documentation, without official records, without the kind of paper trail that oversight committees and foreign governments could follow, this was a capability that intelligence services valued and that drug trafficking organizations had developed to a level of operational sophistication that state institutions found difficult to replicate independently. The Contra connection sits inside this framework. Nicaragua in the early 1980s was the center of the Reagan administration's most contentious foreign policy commitment, a covert war against the Sandinista government, funded and armed through a network of middlemen, arms dealers and foreign governments that was specifically designed to avoid the congressional oversight that direct US military involvement would have required. The network needed aircraft. It needed airstrips. It needed people who could move cargo across multiple borders without attracting attention, who had the official relationships to ensure that the wrong customs inspector never opened the wrong container. The Guadalajara cartel had all of these things and was using them constantly in both directions, cocaine and marijuana moving north, cash moving south. The infrastructure was identical. The routes overlapped. The personnel involved in one set of movements were, in several documented cases, also involved in the other. Congressional investigators documented this overlap in the Kerry Committee report of 1989. A Senate subcommittee investigation into drug trafficking and the Contra network that produced nearly 1,000 pages of findings was released to almost complete indifference from the mainstream press and has since been quietly acknowledged by multiple intelligence officials as substantially accurate. The report documented specific flights, specific airstrips in Mexico and Central America. Specific individuals who move between the drug trafficking world and the Contra support network with a regularity that destroyed any claim of coincidence. It did not resolve the central question that the evidence raised, which was whether the CIA had known about the drug trafficking component of these operations and had made a deliberate decision to tolerate it in service of the larger Cold War objective, or whether the agency had been infiltrated and used by trafficking networks that were sophisticated enough to insert themselves into the operational gaps of a covert program. Both possibilities were disturbing in different ways. The first implied institutional complicity in drug trafficking. The second implied that the most powerful intelligence agency in the world had been expertly manipulated by a 40-year-old from Sinaloa with a telephone and an address book. Felix Gallardo has never directly addressed this dimension of the organization's activities in any public statement. In the interviews he gave from prison, careful, measured, the words of a man who had spent decades understanding exactly what the cost of saying the wrong thing could be, he described himself as a businessman who had paid for protection, not a state actor. The characterization was not entirely false, it was simply not complete. Here is what becomes undeniable when all of the documented evidence is laid against each other. By the mid-1980s, the Guadalajara cartel was not operating despite the Mexican state. It was operating as a semi-sanctioned extension of certain functions of the Mexican state, with relationships that extended upward through the DFS into the Interior Ministry and outward through Cold War intelligence networks into the margins of American covert operations in Central America. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the conclusion of a U.S. Senate investigation, supported by DEA operational reports, court testimony from multiple prosecutions, and the subsequent investigations of Mexican journalists who spent careers documenting the specific individuals and specific transactions that connected these worlds. What it means for the story of Felix Gallardo specifically is this. The 4 years during which he walked freely through Guadalajara after Camarina's murder were not simply the result of deep pockets and accommodating officials. They were the result of a set of institutional relationships so entangled that moving against him risked pulling threads that several powerful organizations on both sides of the border were not prepared to see pulled. His arrest, when it finally came, didn't happen because those threads had been resolved. It happened because the political cost of his continued freedom had risen above the political cost of pulling them. And Felix Gallardo had understood this calculation was coming with enough lead time to do something about it. In the months before April 1989, he had several private meetings, not with lawyers, not with the political contacts he had cultivated for decades, not with the Colombian partners who were watching the situation in Mexico with growing concern. He met with the men who ran the regional operations he had built, the Tijuana Corridor, the Juarez Corridor, the Sinaloa Heartland, the Sonora routes. He met them one group at a time, in locations that were not his home, and he communicated something that each of them absorbed differently depending on their temperament. The organization would continue, the plazas would become independent, each operator would own his territory outright, maintain his own political relationships, source his own supply, manage his own American distribution. The Colombian connections would be distributed and renegotiated individually. There would be no central authority after him, and this, though he framed it as a practical restructuring, was in fact the most consequential decision of his entire career. Because a centralized organization, however large, can be negotiated with. Its leaders can be arrested, replaced, pressured into cooperation. A single authority creates a single point of failure, and equally a single point of leverage. What Felix Gallardo was creating in those quiet meetings was something that had no single point of anything. It was a deliberate distribution of power so complete that no arrest, no prosecution, no law enforcement operation could address more than one piece of it at a time, while the other pieces continued operating. He was not protecting himself. He was protecting the system. The most important of those final meetings happened in the resort city of Acapulco, in a hotel room with ocean views that nobody in the room was looking at sometime in early 1989. The specific date has never been confirmed. The guest list has been partially reconstructed from subsequent prosecutions, organizational histories, and the testimony of people who were not in the room but received instructions from people who were. Among those present, or represented by trusted intermediaries, was the logistics coordinator from La Tuna, now in his early 30s, experienced enough to run a major operation, trusted enough to be handed one of the most valuable corridors in the entire network. What each man was given in that room, and what each of them did with it afterward, is the story of the next 30 years of Mexican organized crime. But the room in Acapulco comes later. First, there was April 8th. First, there was the dinner table, and the agents at the door, and the phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes. And the question that has been waiting since the beginning of this story, who was this man really, and what did he actually build, is about to receive an answer more complete and more unsettling than most people who followed his arrest ever understood. The meeting in Acapulco happened in late March 1989. The hotel was not chosen for luxury, it was chosen for distance, far enough from Guadalajara and Culiacan that the gathering would not immediately register on the surveillance patterns that federal agents had established around the organization's known operational centers. Acapulco in those years was a city living on the fading memory of its own glamour, the resort hotels still functioning but carrying the slightly worn quality of places whose best decade had passed. Nobody looked twice at businessmen meeting in conference rooms. Felix Gallardo arrived without ceremony. No convoy, no visible security, no behavior that announced his importance to anyone watching the lobby. The men who joined him represented the complete geography of everything he had built. The Arellano Felix brothers, or the senior ones among them, Benjamin and Ramon, came representing the Tijuana corridor. Amado Carrillo Fuentes came representing Juarez. Other operators came for Sonora, for the Gulf Coast, for the various secondary routes that had been developed during the expansion years. The Sinaloa heartland was represented by a group that included, among its members, the logistics coordinator from La Tuna, whose operational record over the previous decade had earned him a level of trust that translated directly into the quality of what he was about to receive. Felix Gallardo communicated the restructuring without theatre or ceremony. Each man was being given a plaza. Not signed one, not lent one, given one, outright, with the political infrastructure that came with it, the Colombian supply relationships relevant to that corridor, and the operational autonomy to develop it as he saw fit. The central coordination that had previously run through Guadalajara would cease. There would be no more single telephone that connected all the pieces. There would be no more arbitration of disputes by a central authority. No more unified response to external pressure. No more shared strategic decision-making. What Felix Gallardo was distributing was not just territory. He was distributing the organizational concept itself. The idea that a sufficiently protected, sufficiently capitalized regional operation could sustain itself independently, without reference to any larger structure. He had proven the concept worked at the national scale. He was now franchising it. The man from La Tuna walked out of that room with the Sinaloa corridor, the Pacific routes, the mountain infrastructure, the supply relationships that ran through the state where both of them had been born. He was 31 years old, He had a 5th-grade education. He had never run anything at this scale independently. He had also never, in over a decade of operational work, made a significant mistake. His name, by this point, was beginning to mean something within the organization. Outside it, he was still nobody. Joaquin Guzman Loera drove back to Sinaloa with a plaza. 10 days later, federal agents knocked on a door in Guadalajara, and Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo walked to meet them. The arrest itself was almost aggressively anticlimactic. No weapons discharged, no chase, no negotiation at the threshold. He was placed in a vehicle and driven to Mexico City, where he was processed and charged with drug trafficking and crimes against health, the standard legal architecture applied to cartel figures in Mexican law. The Attorney General appeared on television. The word historic was used several times. In the cells and safe houses and ordinary homes where the men from the Acapulco meeting had returned to their work, the news arrived with a quality closer to confirmation than surprise. They had been told this was coming. They had received their instructions. The machine had already been reconfigured to run without its designer. For the first 2 years of his imprisonment, Felix Gallardo continued to operate. He was held at the Reclusorio Sur prison in Mexico City, a facility that, in the late 1980s, operated with a permeability that made the word prison feel approximate. Telephones were accessible. Visitors arrived regularly. Instructions moved outward through a network of lawyers, family members, and trusted intermediaries who carried information in both directions with a fluency that suggested nobody in the facility's administration was particularly motivated to stop them. He continued making decisions. He continued resolving disputes. The organization he had officially handed over continued, in practice, to receive guidance from the man now behind bars. The plaza bosses tolerated this because for the moment, the old authority still carried weight. His name still opened doors with political contacts. His judgment on disputes between the new independent organizations was still sought and generally respected. The fiction that he was retired, that the restructuring was complete, that the Acapulco distribution was final, this fiction coexisted with the reality that nobody had yet fully tested what the new independence actually meant. Then, in 1991, the prison phone access was systematically cut. What followed was not gradual, it was immediate. The disputes that Felix Gallardo had been quietly managing from his cell, border tensions between the Tijuana and Sinaloa operations, disagreements over specific crossing points, the friction generated by ambitious young operators testing the limits of their new autonomy. These disputes had no referee anymore. The Acapulco restructuring had explicitly eliminated the referee position. There was no mechanism for resolution that all parties had agreed to recognize. The Tijuana cartel, under Benjamin and Ramon Arellano Felix, moved first. Benjamin was the strategist, cold, precise, deeply concerned with maintaining institutional relationships with the political and law enforcement structures that had sustained the original organization. Ramon was something the original organization had never quite produced. A man who used violence not as a tool of last resort but as a preferred language. Someone who had concluded that the most effective deterrent was not the threat of violence, but its enthusiastic demonstration. The Arellano Felix brothers began pushing the boundaries of their assigned territory westward and southward, encroaching on routes and relationships that the Sinaloa faction considered its own. The Sinaloa faction pushed back. The pushing escalated through 1992 into something that was clearly going to produce bodies, the only question being whose and how many. The answer came in a parking lot in Puerto Vallarta in November 1992, when gunmen connected to the Arellano Felix brothers attempted to kill Joaquin Guzman Loera. He survived. Several people around him did not. The assassination attempt transformed what had been a territorial dispute into something personal, and therefore considerably more dangerous. By early 1993, the war between Tijuana and Sinaloa was producing casualties at a rate that was becoming impossible for the Mexican government to absorb publicly. Shootings in restaurants, bodies in cars. The specific urban violence of a war being fought through proxies in populated areas where civilians occupied the wrong space at the wrong moment. On May 24, 1993, at the Guadalajara International Airport, the same city where Felix Gallardo had built his empire, where Camarena had been taken from the street 8 years before, Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo arrived to meet an incoming flight. He was 70 years old, the Archbishop of Guadalajara, one of the most senior Catholic figures in Mexico. He stepped out of a white Grand Marquis in the airport's arrival zone. Gunmen from the Arellano Felix organization were at the airport that day, targeting Guzman Loera, who was also arriving on a flight. In the chaos of the attempted assassination, the specific catastrophic chaos of armed men making lethal decisions at high speed in a crowded public space, the Cardinal was shot 14 times. He died before reaching the hospital. The murder of a Catholic cardinal shocked Mexico in a way that years of cartel violence had not managed. Politicians who had maintained careful distances from the drug war demanded action. The Church institutionally brought a moral weight to the demand that the government could not dismiss. Guzman Loera fled to Guatemala, was captured, and was extradited to Mexico. His first arrest, the one that would not hold. In his cell in Mexico City, Felix Gallardo received the news of the Cardinal's death with an awareness of exactly what it represented. The controlled violence that had been the Guadalajara cartel's operational principle, calculated, targeted, designed to achieve specific objectives while avoiding the kind of spectacle that forced political responses, had died in that airport parking lot along with the Cardinal. What he had spent 20 years building was consuming itself. The organizations that bore the names of their new leaders, Tijuana, Sinaloa, Juarez, Gulf, were going to war with each other across the geography he had designed for cooperation. The political infrastructure he had maintained through personal relationships and personal credibility was fracturing as the new bosses discovered that their individual leverage with officials was a fraction of what the unified organization had commanded. The Colombian partners, watching the chaos, were quietly beginning to explore direct relationships with whichever Mexican operators proved most stable, accelerating the independence of each faction and eliminating the coordination that had made the whole system work. He had built a machine that ran on one fuel, the managed authority of a single trusted center. Remove the center and the machine did not stop. It accelerated. But it accelerated without direction, without brakes, without the institutional memory of why certain lines had been drawn, and why crossing them had consequences that outweighed any short-term gain. In Mexico City, now transferred to the maximum security Almoloya de Juarez prison, which the government was constructing specifically to house the figures it could no longer afford to hold in permeable facilities, Felix Gallardo sat with the specific stillness of a man who understood precisely what was happening and had run out of mechanisms to influence it. The phone was gone. The visitors were restricted. The political contacts that had kept him insulated for so long were now focused on managing the chaos his successors were generating, not on maintaining the comfort of the man who had created them. Outside the prison walls, across the country he had reorganized from a conference room in Acapulco. The organizations he had named and placed and handed to trusted men were killing each other over the lines he had drawn. And a young man from the mountains of Sinaloa, recently arrested in Guatemala and returned to Mexico under circumstances that would raise questions for years, was sitting in a different cell, in a different prison, with the particular patience of someone who was not finished. The 1990s were the decade in which everything Felix Gallardo had assembled began producing consequences that no single person had designed or anticipated. Each plaza he had distributed in that Acapulco hotel room became its own world, with its own logic, its own leadership style, its own relationship to violence, and its own trajectory toward either dominance or destruction. The map of Mexican organized crime that emerged over the following decade was not random. It was the direct inheritance of decisions made in one afternoon by one man who was now watching it unfold from behind the walls of Almoloya de Juarez, then later the Puente Grande facility in Jalisco, then eventually the Altiplano maximum security prison in the state of Mexico. He would spend the rest of his life in those walls. He is still there now. The first of his inheritors to reach genuine national dominance was the man nobody had initially considered the most dangerous person in the room. Amado Carrillo Fuentes had received the Juarez Corridor, the Ciudad Juarez crossing into El Paso, Texas, a route with enormous capacity but one that had been relatively underdeveloped compared to the Tijuana operation. What Carrillo Fuentes did with it over the following years revealed a strategic intelligence that even people who had known him closely had underestimated. He did not fight the other organizations for their territory. He worked his own with a quiet, systematic intensity that prioritized volume over visibility. He invested heavily in aircraft, not the small single-engine planes that most traffickers used, but commercial-sized Boeing 727 jets, modified for cargo, capable of moving multi-ton cocaine shipments in a single flight. At the peak of his operation in the mid-1990s, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was moving more cocaine into the United States than any other single operator in history. The DEA gave him a title that was simultaneously accurate and insufficient: the Lord of the Skies. His personal net worth was estimated at $25 billion, a figure so large that several analysts questioned whether the global financial system had the capacity to launder it. He was the most powerful drug lord on Earth. Then, in July 1997, he checked into a private clinic in Mexico City for elective surgery. The procedure was not medically necessary. He wanted his face changed, his nose reshaped, his cheeks altered, the features that appeared in DEA photographs and Mexican law enforcement files softened into something that would not be recognized. He also wanted liposuction, to alter the body shape that witnesses described. He was 49 years old, worth $25 billion, the undisputed lord of the most powerful drug corridor in North America. And he wanted to disappear. The surgery lasted 8 hours. He never regained consciousness. The official cause of death was listed as a reaction to the anesthetic combined with an overdose of flumezanil, a drug used to reverse sedation. The doctors who performed the procedure were found months later, both of them, encased in concrete inside steel drums, discovered at a construction site outside Mexico City. Whether the surgery went wrong by accident or by design has never been definitively established. The Juarez cartel fractured after his death, consumed by internal succession disputes that produced years of violence and eventually yielded the corridor to the expanding Sinaloa organization, to the man from La Tuna who had been released from his first Mexican prison in 2001 after 8 years of custody, through the unlocking of a laundry cart, through a tunnel, through a sequence of events that the Mexican government spent years insisting was a sophisticated escape, and that most observers understood as something simpler and more expensive. Joaquin Guzman Loera walked out of Puente Grande prison on January 19, 2001. He walked back into an organization that had been waiting for him, with the particular readiness of an operation that had been carefully maintained in his absence by lieutenants who understood their role was custodial, not permanent. Within months he was operating again. Within years he was expanding into the corridors left vacant by the Juarez cartel's internal collapse. Within a decade, the Sinaloa cartel had become the largest drug trafficking organization in the history of the world, operating in over 50 countries, moving cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and eventually fentanyl, generating revenues that multiple economists estimated exceeded the GDP of several Central American nations combined. The Tijuana cartel took a different trajectory. Ramon Arellano Felix, the violent engine of the organization's enforcement capacity, was killed in February 2002 during a confrontation in Mazatlan, shot by a police officer he had approached while disguised. He was 37. 1 month later, Benjamin Arellano Felix was captured by Mexican federal police in Puebla, found in a house where he had been living under an assumed identity with a wife and children who knew him by a different name. The organization that the brothers had built, one of the most violently efficient trafficking operations Mexico had ever seen, responsible for hundreds of killings across Baja California through the 1990s, began contracting almost immediately after both senior figures were removed. Younger brothers attempted to maintain the operation with diminishing success and increasing casualties. The Tijuana corridor, which Felix Gallardo had considered one of his most valuable assets when he placed the Arellano Felix family in charge of it, was absorbed piece by piece into the Sinaloa operation over the following decade. Rafael Caro Quintero, sitting in his Mexican prison cell since 1985, had been sentenced to 40 years. He served 28. In August 2013, a Mexican federal court released him on a legal technicality, a jurisdictional argument about which court had authority over his original prosecution. He walked out of prison at age 60, went to ground in Sinaloa, and was not found by authorities for nearly a decade. The DEA, which had been hunting him since 1985, placed a $20 million reward on his capture. He was arrested again in July 2022 in a rural area of Sinaloa and extradited to the United States in 2023 to face charges that included the Camarena murder and decades of subsequent trafficking activity. He was 70 years old at extradition. The case that Enrique Camarena had died building was still moving through legal systems nearly 4 decades after his murder. Don Neto, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, was convicted in Mexico and sentenced to 40 years. He remained in custody, elderly and reportedly in declining health, at various Mexican facilities. His nephew's empire, the Juarez operation that Amado had built to global scale, had collapsed into the organization of the man from La Tuna, the quiet logistics coordinator who had once been the least remarkable person at the Acapulco table. Guzman Loera was arrested a second time in February 2014, captured in a hotel room in Mazatlan by Mexican Marines working with DEA intelligence, taken without the firefight that his mythology suggested would be necessary to bring him in. He escaped again in July 2015, through a tunnel that began in the shower of his cell at the Altiplano prison, the same facility where Felix Gallardo was being held. A tunnel equipped with a motorcycle rail system, lighting and ventilation, a construction project that had been ongoing for months directly beneath a maximum security facility without detection. He was recaptured in January 2016, extradited to the United States in January 2017, convicted in February 2019, and sentenced to life plus 30 years in a federal supermax prison in Colorado. His trial produced testimony about the Sinaloa cartel's operations that covered 3 decades of activity: routes, payments, murders, political connections, and documented, among many other things, the degree to which the organization he had built was the direct operational descendant of what Felix Gallardo had assembled in Guadalajara in the early 1980s. The Sinaloa cartel did not collapse after Guzman Loera's extradition. Its current leadership, a collective of figures including Ismael El Mayo Zambada, who had been with the organization since the Guadalajara years, continued operating with a structural resilience that reflected the organizational philosophy Felix Gallardo had established 4 decades earlier. No single point of failure, no irreplaceable individual, the system larger than any person within it. In his prison cell, across the decades of his incarceration, Felix Gallardo gave occasional interviews to journalists who obtained access through the legal channels that Mexican law nominally provided. The man who emerged from those interviews was consistent across the years, measured, precise, intellectually engaged, showing none of the deterioration that long incarceration produces in most people. He described himself as a scapegoat, a man sacrificed by a political system that had actively participated in everything it then prosecuted him for. He acknowledged the organization. He acknowledged the payments to officials. He denied ordering Camarina's murder, consistently and specifically, maintaining that he had attempted to prevent it and that the decision had been made over his objection. His eyesight began deteriorating seriously in his 50s. By his late 60s, he was nearly blind, a condition that his lawyers argued in multiple petitions for medical transfer or house arrest constituted a humanitarian concern requiring a change in his custodial conditions. The Mexican judicial system considered these petitions and denied them. He turned 77 in 2023. Outside the prison, the country that the organization he built had helped shape was processing 3 decades of consequences. The Mexican government's own estimates place the death toll from cartel-related violence since 2006, when President Felipe Calderón launched a military-style campaign against the organizations, at over 350,000 people. The actual number, accounting for disappearances and unreported killings, was considered by most researchers to be significantly higher. The DEA agents who had pursued the Guadalajara cartel through the 1980s retired in stages through the 1990s and 2000s. Several wrote memoirs, several gave lectures. Several described the Camarina case as the defining experience of their careers and expressed, with varying degrees of restraint, the opinion that full accountability for his murder had never been achieved, that the highest level participants in the decision to kidnap and interrogate an American federal agent had never faced a courtroom. Mica Camarina, Enrique's widow, continued living in the United States. She had advocated for years for a full accounting of her husband's murder, including the institutional dimensions that prosecutions of individual cartel figures had consistently left unaddressed. She had named names. She had made specific allegations about specific people in specific institutions. The institutions had not responded in the way she had requested. Her husband's face appeared on a DEA memorial wall in Washington. February 7th was designated by Congress as Red Ribbon Week in his memory, a national drug awareness observance that bears his name while the questions his murder raised remain, decades later, without complete answers. Whether those answers exist somewhere, in sealed files, in the memories of people who are still alive, in the institutional knowledge of agencies that have never been compelled to fully disclose, is a question that the documented evidence neither confirms nor resolves. What the documented evidence does confirm is this. The organizations that Felix Gallardo created in that Acapulco hotel room in early 1989 are still operating. They have changed names, leadership, and primary products. The fentanyl crisis that is killing Americans at a rate that dwarfs any previous drug epidemic flows through the same organizational infrastructure, the same border corridors, the same distribution networks that were established in the early 1980s by a man who learned what he needed to know in a governor's household in Culiacan. The machine is still running. And the man who built it is nearly blind, in a cell, in a country whose criminal geography he drew with his own hands. Return to April 8th, 1989. The dinner table, the half-finished plate, the dog barking 2 blocks over in the particular silence of a Guadalajara evening that had no reason to feel different from any other evening, except that it was. The federal agents are at the door, dozens of them, arranged in the street with the rigid formation of men performing an action they have rehearsed but never quite believed they would be allowed to complete. Inside, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo stands from the table, picks up the telephone and makes a call that lasts less than 2 minutes. The story began here. It ends here. But the meaning of this moment is entirely different now. That phone call was not a farewell. It was not a desperate attempt to warn someone or move something, or trigger an escape plan that had been prepared for this contingency. The Acapulco meeting had already happened. The plazas had already been distributed. The men who received them had already returned to their territories and begun operating under the new architecture. Everything that needed to be arranged had been arranged weeks earlier, in a hotel room overlooking an ocean that nobody in the room was watching. The phone call was the final confirmation, a signal, not an instruction. He was telling someone, one person, presumably the most important person in the chain of what came next, that the moment had arrived, that the transition was now operational, that the machine should run. Then he put the phone down and walked to the door. Consider what that walk actually was. Not a defeat, not surrender in any conventional sense. A man who had spent his entire adult life studying how power works, who had learned it in a governor's household, refined it in a federal police uniform, tested it through 20 years of building an organization that operated at the intersection of crime and state, walking toward an outcome he had calculated, prepared for, and incorporated into the design of everything he had built. The arrest was the last move of the game, not the end of the game. The agents put the handcuffs on a man who had already done what he came to do. Now look at what the 2 minutes of that phone call produced across the following 35 years. The Sinaloa Cartel became the most powerful criminal organization in the history of the Western Hemisphere, operating cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and fentanyl distribution networks across 6 continents. The fentanyl flowing through those networks, the synthetic opioid that has killed over 100,000 Americans per year at the peak of the current crisis, moves through border crossings that Felix Gallardo identified as strategically valuable in the early 1980s, and that remain the primary entry points for narcotics into the United States today. The infrastructure he built outlasted every individual who inherited it. It outlasted El Chapo, who was in a Colorado Supermax. It outlasted the Arellano Felix brothers. It outlasted Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who died trying to erase his own face on an operating table. The machine outlasted the machinists. Felix Gallardo is 77 years old. He has been in prison for longer than many of the people now running the organizations he created have been alive. His eyesight is nearly gone. He navigates his cell and the prison corridors in the particular darkness of a man for whom the physical world has contracted to what he can feel with his hands. His legal petitions for medical transfer, submitted and resubmitted over years, have been denied with the consistency of a judicial system that has no interest in creating the optics of compassion for the man credited with building the infrastructure that produces Mexico's cartel violence. He has never been extradited to the United States. American prosecutors have wanted him. The requests have been made. The Mexican government has declined, citing the ongoing domestic prosecution, citing jurisdiction, citing the procedural architecture that surrounds a case this old and this entangled. Whether the real reason is legal or political, whether there are people in Mexico who remain invested in keeping his complete testimony out of an American courtroom, is not a question the Mexican government has addressed directly. In the interviews he gave over the years, conducted through prison glass or in monitored visiting rooms with journalists whose access was carefully managed, he returned repeatedly to a specific characterization of himself. Not as innocent. He never claimed that, not as a victim in any simple sense. He described himself as a product of a system that used him and then discarded him when the political cost of his continued utility exceeded the political cost of his prosecution. The system he described was real. The documentation supports its existence. Whether that framing fully accounts for the decisions he made, the organization he built, the violence it generated directly and indirectly, the 35 years of consequences still accumulating, is a calculation each person who hears his story makes privately. His children live in Mexico under their own names, leading lives that are, by all available evidence, ordinary. They did not inherit an empire. They inherited a surname that requires explanation and a father who has been behind glass for their entire adult lives. The wealth that the organization generated, the hundreds of millions, the possible billions, was never conclusively located or seized. What remains of it, where it went, whose hands it passed through on its way to wherever it rests now, is part of the permanent archaeology of a case that has never been fully excavated. Enrique Camarena's 3 sons grew up without their father. Mica Camarena is still alive. The specific fact she knows about her husband's murder, the institutional facts, the names above the names that have been prosecuted, she has spoken about publicly, in testimony and in interviews, to an audience that has been insufficient to the weight of what she was describing. The DEA still trains new agents on the Camarena case, not as a historical footnote, as an operational lesson about what happens when a single determined investigator gets close enough to the real architecture of a sophisticated organization, not just the product and the roots, but the political infrastructure that makes the product and the roots possible. The lesson, as it is apparently taught, is about the danger. It is not about what to do when you find what Camarena found. That question, what the appropriate institutional response is when a drug trafficking organization is so deeply integrated into the political apparatus of a sovereign nation that prosecuting the organization means implicating the state, remains as unresolved in 2024 as it was in 1985, when a federal agent's body was found wrapped in plastic outside a small town in Michoacán. The street in Guadalajara where Felix Gallardo was arrested is an ordinary street. The house is still there. Nobody has marked it. There is no plaque, no historical designation, no acknowledgement that the most consequential night in the history of Mexican organized crime took place in that particular residential quiet. The neighborhood looks exactly as it looked in 1989. Neat houses behind iron gates, a dog somewhere in the distance, the lights in the neighbouring houses keeping to themselves. The machine that was set in motion that night has never stopped. Every year, tens of thousands of people die from overdoses involving narcotics that travelled through the infrastructure he designed. Every year, Mexican journalists who cover cartel activity are killed at rates that make Mexico one of the most dangerous countries in the world for the press. Every year, the organizations whose founding can be traced to a hotel room in Acapulco and a telephone call in Guadalajara generate revenues that corrupt institutions, finance political campaigns, and shape the governance of entire regions of 2 countries. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo sits in the dark with what he knows. The boy from Culiacan who watched how power worked from the margins of a governor's household, who learned the architecture of the Mexican state from the inside, who built an organization so well designed that arresting him only multiplied it. That boy is an old man now, nearly blind in a cell, with decades of silence where a telephone used to be. He built a machine. The machine runs. Nobody has found the off switch. And the one thing that has never been fully answered, the question that sits beneath every prosecution, every extradition, every congressional report, every overdose statistic, every name on every memorial wall, is whether the machine was ever meant to have one.